being hailed as a first-of-its-kind agreement. Earlier this week, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was in Haida Gwaii to sign the Haida Title Lands Agreement. It acknowledges historic injustices and provides recognition of Haida Aboriginal title to lands on Haida Gwaii. It marks a significant milestone in the journey to reconciliation. For more, our Truth in Politics panel is here. Jennifer Leywitz is the CEO of Pasqua Harbour Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair is the columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Jennifer, Niigaan, thanks for being with us. Niigaan, just want to say congrats on receiving the King Charles III Coronation Medal this morning, and thanks for still making time for the panel here today.
It's a little ironic to get medals honoring the King and to be an Indigenous person. But here I am in the Governor General's house in Ottawa, and happy to be here.
Well, we'll start with you this week and talking about Haida Gwaii. And why do you suppose that outgoing Prime Minister Trudeau says Canada is recognizing or giving back Aboriginal title of Haida Gwaii to the Haida people?
During a prime minister's final days, it's pretty typical to sort of see a greatest hits. And I think this is one of Trudeau's legacy. It's one of the things that he cares about a lot. He went to Haida Gwaii with his father, Pierre Trudeau, former prime minister, as a young boy. He also, most of his early career as a teacher, was developed in BC, particularly out in Victoria, the Vancouver Island. I mean, this is something that he cares a lot about. He even has a Haida tattoo on his shoulder. This is a particular agreement is similar to what you saw during the creation of Nunavut. It's the recognition of Indigenous title over a particular set. And of course, if anyone doesn't know about Haida Gwaii, it's the North Island from Vancouver Island, just north. And now the Haida people, who have been struggling for almost 40 years, originally over mineral rights, logging rights, they now have title, absolute title, the recognition of their title under the Canadian Constitution, which means that they get jurisdiction, likely going to be governance in some form or another. And it could be the creation of a new territory for Canada at some point in the future, similar to how we saw Nunavut. Different than Nunavut, though, we've got one particular Indigenous nation which is recognized as having jurisdiction as opposed to many in the case of Nunavut. So this is a pretty landmark agreement and something that Trudeau cared a lot about. It will be his legacy. Reconciliation will be the legacy of Justin Trudeau, amongst a few other things. He did have some very big inroads, one of the most progressive prime ministers for First Nations, Inuit, Métis in history. So I think it's just something he cared a lot about. It was one of his final trips as prime minister to do so.
Jennifer, what do you think about this? Good thing for the Haida Nation, Canada, and Trudeau?
I think this is obviously a good thing for them, especially when it comes to the recognition of any type of rights. Obviously, it's a little bit different for us out in Saskatchewan here, where we have the number of treaties and our, existence with those treaties and the way that those treaties came about, especially in historical context, is quite a bit different. It's almost remarkable to see what that recognition of jurisdiction over your land looks like in modern day. I'm going to be having a conversation with my kids because I feel like we're seeing history being made right in front of us. In terms of what's good for Canada, I think immediately I go back to what is currently happening with the United States President, Donald Trump, and the conversations of undermining Canada. And, I did have a post on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago saying that undermining Canada is also undermining First Nations and our jurisdiction and our sovereignty. And I think this is kind of a little bit of a we're in an entirely different relationship here in this land, in Canada, with the Crown, and that needs to be acknowledged, especially when people, promote or even entertain the conversation of Canada becoming a 51st state. And for Trudeau, I echo what Niigaan said. I am obviously not a huge fan of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, but at the same time, you cannot deny the fact that he has considered the rights of Indigenous people long before it was recognized by any other prime minister, unfortunately, especially because he came in at a time where it was reaching a pivotal moment on whether or not Indigenous people were going to start being treated fairly in this country. And Bill C-92, I think, will also be a big part of the Liberal legacy. And I think that this is just furthering that conversation on sovereignty, and it's going to hand the next prime minister of our country a very, very big responsibility and obligation to start recognizing First Nations rights, not just for child welfare, not just for land rights, but in the conversation of education and justice in all different areas.
And Niigaan, in the case of Haida Gwaii, why is it necessary for Canada to recognize this type of title?
So this is Aboriginal title under the Constitution, which is not a creation of another nation state. Like I think some people might wish to, or perhaps misunderstand this agreement to be even created. One of the things that the opposition Conservatives in BC were quickly to criticize about this agreement was to say, oh, well, the private landowners that are already in existence on Haida Gwaii will somehow have to leave, or their land will be turned over. My favorite response to that was Crown Relations Minister Gary Ndesangari, who said, not in any way. That's not even a part of this conversation. How this looks will go out over the next 5 to 6 years. There will be some negotiations, some shared idea of probably shared governance, something similar to what we see in BC around the co-management of natural areas. Probably would be something what this looks like. And I mentioned before Nunavut, it will be Indigenous controlled. I actually optimistically think this might be the creation of a new territory for Canada in the future, so that we won't see just 10 provinces and 3 territories, we might see 4. And I think that that is an interesting and exciting and innovative approach. And it's something in which Indigenous peoples have been seeking for a very long period of time. Not always a separation to the Crown. Some First Nations want that, but to have a relationship with the Crown that is both a sanctimonious relationship, an eternal relationship, which is about sharing and co-governance, or perhaps Canada being underneath the governments of a First Nations governments. Maybe that's what it looks like.
Jennifer, do you see bigger implications from all of this?
I think the implications will obviously come from the opposition to this, like Niigaan had said, with the Conservative Party in British Columbia. I think there is obviously going to be people pushing back on the idea of this, especially because right now there's this really weird conversation that we've been having because of President Donald Trump's comments, where I feel like there's been people that have just been making comments kind of off the top of their head on entertaining the idea of Canada being a 51st state. But this now brings the conversation of who was here first and what do those rights actually look like. And Canada does have that relationship with First Nations that they not only need to acknowledge, but they need to prioritize. And I'm hoping to see that a little bit more in the coming weeks, as, you know, even I saw a news article today that Donald Trump, again, I think he's totally serious about trying to take over Canada. And I think now more than ever, we don't just need our allies, but we need our Canadian government to really be at the forefront of protecting us and our relationship.
Niigaan, word is out that the feds are cutting off the funding for the National Advisory Committee on Residential Schools, Missing Children, and Unmarked Burials, and that the Survivors Secretariat won't be refunded. What's your take on these cuts?
It's worthwhile noting that while this is being cut on an argument of funding, an argument of not that there's the unmarked graves have been discovered or that there's some sort of progress made on the issue overhaul over the tens of thousands of children lost at residential schools. There is an equal announcement being made by Justin Trudeau's government around the creation of a high-speed train line that will travel between Toronto and Quebec City, which will cost just for setting it up, just for developing the project, not putting any stakes in the ground just yet, but just developing the project is about $4 billion. And a price tag in that kind of project is worth probably around $30, $40, $50 billion. This is an issue in which you see a government changing, transitioning in a different direction. We're probably going to see Mark Carney become the next prime minister, maybe for a brief time, maybe for a longer time. And if not, then Pierre Poilievre. There will be a radical change for First Nations, Inuit, Métis people who are then, who is for the past 10 years, decade or so, have been used to a very friendly federal government. Not so much maybe with provincial governments, but with the federal government making many big inroads, especially around the issue of funding. I think about the Manitoba Métis Federation, the amount of funding that they've gotten from under the Trudeau Liberals. That time period is coming to an end. This is indicative of a federal government that doesn't see a lot of political capital in investing further in this issue, looking at more economic issues, trying to gain the support that they can heading into a federal election. And unfortunately, this is an issue that will be left behind. Whether federal governments in the future will pick this up is yet to be seen.
Jennifer, perhaps more sinister, though, the Survivor Secretariat telling us and others that they feel like this might be payback for being critical of the Liberal government. and also saying that they think they're just the first, that others are likely going to lose their funding. What do you think this means for searches?
Oh, in terms of whether or not this is because they're being critical, it's hard to say. I echo what Nigon said, where I think we're just seeing a new direction being taken, and it might not be anything too political or too purposeful to hurt anybody. But at the same time, what I am concerned about is the rise in residential school denialism, and that there's been realistically, in historical context of how long residential schools operated in Canada and the searches now that are taking place, there was such a short window to really try to uncover what happened and what may have happened to the people that went missing compared to the legacy that exists for residential schools in this country. And my nation is one of them that has been putting in the work and attempting to do that searching. And it's frustrating because, as anybody knows, I faced quite a bit of backlash for pushing back on residential school denialists. And I feel like this is just another issue that it's like, well, now we can't even figure it out because the funding is being cut left and right. And I just don't foresee a conservative government being too optimistic or giving when it comes to funding for various different areas like this.
Lots we could have discussed there, but wanted to move on. And Jennifer, sticking with you, it's been a particularly violent week, or couple of weeks really, especially here on the prairies. Homicides, stabbings, the quadruple homicide in Carry the Kettle still fresh. Shootings in broad daylight in Winnipeg's North End. A chief being assaulted here in Manitoba. Jennifer, what's going on?
There's a lot of violence happening, and there's this really uncomfortable truth that exists, that it is a lot to do with our own people that are participating in it. Unfortunately, it's hurting our people in our communities. You know, we saw the tragedy on James Smith several years ago, which is very close to home for me. And now we're seeing it almost more widespread and happening in a more lawless way. I think it is important to remember that a lot of the violence that we saw against First Nations or Indigenous people from non-Indigenous people was typically rooted in things like power and control, especially through the legacy. But I truly believe that a lot of the violence and the hurt that we're seeing amongst our own people is coming from a place of quite literally that. It's coming from hurt, it's coming from lack of direction, it's coming from broken families. And I think it's really important for us to get back to that place of restoring a lot of what is there to heal us. And for me, you know, it has to do with my kids. It's incredibly important that you break that cycle so your kids don't see those addictions, they don't see that hardship, you know, because those harmful behaviors that we do pass down are perpetuated and they will continue as a cycle. And right now, more than ever, I think we need to see resources and we need to see it quickly. We talk about First Nations policing, which will help from Indigenous people getting hurt or killed at the hands of police. But at the end of the day, we need to go back to the root cause, and we are going to need supports. We're going to need supports not only for the moms the minute they start carrying that child, but the supports going through. There's a lot of grandparents that are involved in helping raise kids now, and giving hope back to communities and nations for funding in various different areas, not just addictions and mental health, but community gardens, food sovereignty, you know, maybe horse therapy, any type of those areas that can bring back. And I can tell you in good conscience that there are a lot of nations that are doing that work and see that vision right now. And I think we're going to see a lot of positive come out of that.
Nigon, you wrote a column this week on what one First Nation in northern Manitoba is trying to do to combat, drugs, violence in the community. But what's your take on what's been happening here as of late?
Egregious problems need egregious solutions. And what you're seeing in northern Manitoba is communities who have been, if you look at Keewatin Tribal Council, that's 11 First Nations. They've claimed that there is such a series of challenges that have been created over longstanding issues of infrastructure, drug and alcohol abuse. Most of the First Nations have banned alcohol or have some kind of system in place in which they hold people accountable within their community if alcohol or drugs is a part of their community's lives and creates situations of violence. What you're seeing is First Nations taking it upon themselves, giving up on those infrastructures that typically Manitobans and Canadians would expect to protect them. That's things like the RCMP, that's things like local government, or even having local band council resolutions recognized by things like the RCMP or healthcare facilities or so on. They're turning away from that, and they're simply turning inward and saying, we're going to hold each other accountable. We're going to publish lists with individuals who we claim are bringing drugs into the community, bringing alcohol into the community, harboring people that are doing that, et cetera. What this indicates is two things. One is a post-pandemic response where emergencies have turned into real critical emergencies, like life and death, everyday situations. The second is that what you're seeing is an elder once said to me that when we go away, when the language advocates, when the cultural supports, the people who run those lodges, when they start to die, the young people have to pick up that work, or what will happen is an atrophy of the community. The community will start to fall apart. And so that's why what Jennifer said just a minute ago is so critically important. We have to double down on the cultural institutions that have kept us together for thousands of years. This is what will keep us going for the future. And sometimes that looks like all these different things that Jennifer spoke about. I mean, I would call it the lodge, I would call it our ceremonies, but I would call it spending time with your grandparents, spending time with your parents on the land, beading, making medicines, making drums, learning the songs. Like, those are all the things that have brought us to this place. Those are the things that need to be held on to the most. And unfortunately, drugs, alcohol, even the internet, things that take us away from our time together, this is what creates these situations. And they're certainly not totally to blame. They are something in which we also need infrastructures that have put us into poverty to step up and to take a bigger role in assisting us. And policing may be one of those things as well, having our own policing systems. But the fact is that we've reached a critical situation on most First Nations, particularly in northern Manitoba, and something has to be done about it, whether it be the community taking it upon themselves and just giving up on those things outside, or a collaboration, which is how it should have been, how treaties were supposed to build our relationships and should be doing so today.
Lastly here, Leonard Peltier is home on the Turtle Mountain Reservation after spending 49 years behind bars. Jennifer, is this a time to celebrate?
Oh, that's a tough question because there is a lot of controversy around his release and the victims' families that feel impacted by his release. I think there's this critical difference that we need to make here, that we can acknowledge both the fact that this absolutely will have an impact on victims and their families and the people that are upset about his release, while at the same time recognizing that there is this monumental decision that was made by the Biden administration to release him back to his support and his home. And I was watching a little bit of the coverage yesterday and like the drumming and everything that was done. And I think there was this, I guess this is just metaphor for overcoming the injustice that he might have faced, especially because he was such a big activist and advocated for the things that we are still advocating for today. So I think there's just those two really difficult pieces of how do you bring those together, or can you? But I think this was, in hindsight, a good thing. And it was good for other people to see that he is able to leave and to go home. And I think he was quoted yesterday saying, "We beat them," or something like that.
Niigaan, your thoughts on the return of Leonard Peltier to his home?
It's not my place to say whether Anime Aquash's family feel that this is injustice. I think certainly we need to listen to them. And if Leonard Peltier was involved with the murder, which many arrows point to of her, then I think this is something certainly would open up a lot of wounds. And I certainly want to give them time to be able to speak and space. That being said, we're talking about an 80-year-old man who's now on house arrest back home. This is not just a simple release. This is, he still must spend time under watching, following certain parameters, et cetera. Whether he follows those or not, I guess is up to the justice officials and whether that will take place or whether they simply will turn a blind eye. There is a kind of, Leonard Peltier is bigger than just a person. He's become a sort of site, an intersection, a representation of longstanding mistreatment of Native Americans, the over-incarceration of Native Americans. He's also become a kind of site in which, at the time, just as the time period that Indigenous activism was beginning in the United States, there was a hard iron fist that America brought down on Indigenous peoples. And I think Leonard Peltier has become the face of that struggle. The question of whether he spent enough prison time, the question of whether he's done his time, if he was involved in the crime and the murder of Anime Akwash, that's, I think, for others to say, not for us to decide on this panel. But I think, though, what I would say is that it certainly is a moment in American Indian history in which a lot of people feel very vindicated, people who believe in Leonard Peltier's struggle and what he represents more than perhaps the man himself. And that's what I would add to that.
Yeah, APTN News was there for the event yesterday. A lot of people on my social media saying, why didn't you ask this? Why didn't you ask that? I'll just point out that media were not given the opportunity to ask any questions. Niigaan, Jennifer, thanks as always. Congrats again, Niigaan.
Oh, thanks, everybody. Oh my gosh.